Hello, and welcome to our weekly writing Q&A. This week's question is from Pratap Chainuri, which I'm probably butchering, and I'm sorry. And he asks, what is the difference between the first plot point and the first pinch point? Is it possible to write a first plot point and first pinch point only in a single beat? So this is a good question. I think that there's a fair amount of confusion about what the pinch points are. So just really quickly, the way I teach structure, it revolves around the timing of 8 specific sections of the story that are divided by turning points or beats. And within the first half of the story, we have the inciting event, which is halfway through the first act, the first plot point, which is 25% of the way into the story, and is like the swivel between the first act and the second act. And then a quarter of the way into the second act, so about 37% mark, you have the first of 2 pinch points. The second one is in the second half. And so right away, you can see that the short answer to this question is no, that they are not the same and they cannot be the same beat, because one of the primary things of importance to understand about them is that they are, is the timing, right? And so the first plot point takes place at the 25% mark, and the first plot point takes place around the 37% mark. So that timing is really important, because by dividing the story up into equal parts and creating these important turning points, what you're really doing is controlling the story's pacing. And if any one of those sections is too short or too long, and they don't have to be precise, the percentiles are general guidelines, but you do want it to be relatively close, simply because you want each section of the story to have enough space to do what it needs to do to recover from the previous turning point and to build into the subsequent one. So the timing is important. If you were to say combine, structural considerations of what those beats actually do aside, if you were to combine these 2 turning points into one, then either you have a really, really long section before you even get to the first plot point, the first turning point. I mean, you're leading up to somewhere in the range of the 37% mark, which is a long time for readers to wait, particularly that early in the story. Or you have a really long section after the turning point leading up to the midpoint at the 50% mark, in which, if there's no turning point, then technically nothing's happening, nothing's changing the plot. And that can be very problematic for pacing. And the other consideration is, what do these turning points actually do within the story? Now, they share the commonality that they are turning points. That's the most important thing for both of them, in that they introduce new information, characters take irrevocable action in some way so that something changes within the story. There are consequences, new decisions have to be made, and there's forward progression within the plot, right? But the first plot point and the first pinch point, like all of the structural turning points, do have their own specific flavor, and you could say responsibilities within the story. So the first plot point, all of the plot points, there's 3 major plot points. The first plot point at the 25% mark, which divides the first and second acts. The midpoint or second plot point, which is halfway through the entire story at the 50% mark. And the third plot point, which divides the second act and the third act at the 75% mark. Those are the big moments in your story. If you had 3 big moments, those are them. And so you do not want to shortchange those. And what they're doing, is indicating these doors of no return between the acts. So the first plot point specifically is this threshold of no return, in which the character leaves the normal world of the first act and fully engages with the conflict by entering the adventure world of the second act. Whether the setting actually changes or not, it can be totally symbolic. But it is very important, because it's an irrevocable moment in the story where the character, fully enters the plot and the conflict and can't go back. Whereas the first pinch point is not necessarily that irrevocable. It is primarily an emphasis of the antagonistic force and what is at stake for the characters, leading up to, in this instance, the midpoint, and the major turning point that's going to happen there. So it can be a huge moment, but it's generally smaller, with an emphasis more on reaction rather than maybe more of the action that you'd see in the major plot points. So short answer is they're very different. The timing is important because they're 12% of, there's 12% of the story in between them, and that can be a very big chunk depending on how long your story is, and it's important to fully flesh that out. So I hope that's helpful. There's so much more on my site about this. I talk about structure all the time. You can find some of my most popular and important structural posts in the left sidebar. I'm not sure where that shows up on mobile devices. I think there's a drop-down menu. But there's a section on structuring your story with all kinds of articles about this. So if you're confused or you want more definition around plot points and pinch points, you can definitely find that on my site. I also talk about this some in my books, Structuring Your Novel. And I have a free ebook called 5 Secrets of Story Structure, which actually goes into quite a bit of depth about the pinch points. So I hope that was helpful. And if you enjoyed the video or any of my content, I would totally appreciate it if you'd consider just taking a quick second to interact with it in some way, to let YouTube know that you liked it, either by liking it or leaving a comment or something like that. All right, thank you. And if you have a question for next week, be sure to leave it in the comments below.